Welcome, Rich Hoops Pod fans. We finally have our 2023 NBA Finals matchup, and it is a matchup of two teams that people had a lot of doubt for. One team more justifiably was doubted than the other, but nonetheless, two teams with a lot of doubters that a lot of people did not expect it to make out of their conference. In the case of the Miami Heat, really, nobody expected it. So who's going to win the Battle of the Underdogs? Now, real quick, because I'm sure a lot of people are going to comment, how exactly is the first seed an underdog? Which, frankly, I would agree with you. That should be the case. I shouldn't be viewing it in this framework, but frankly, the Nuggets are underdogs because NBA fans are stupid. That's it. And apparently because the Nuggets don't have a compelling enough narrative. At every turn, people have picked other teams to beat them. The Suns were favored heavily in round 2, something I wish I had caught on to at the time because I wasn't really on Twitter at the time. If I had known just how much people were going to pick the Suns, I probably would have made a video about it because I thought that was ludicrous. So the Suns were favored versus last. After they went up 3-0, every single media outlet was like, can the Lakers make a 3-0 comeback? And even the Timberwolves, the fucking Minnesota Timberwolves, who, mind you, did not have Jaden McDaniels, nor did they have Naz Reid, two of their most important players. In spite of that, the Timberwolves were not overwhelmingly expected to lose. Here's a poll with over 8,000 votes taken before the playoffs started. Only 10 more of the people voting in this poll picked Denver than picked Minnesota. It's a fucking joke, man. There's no other way to put it. It is a joke how Denver has been treated by the media and by NBA fans. And thus, they have been an underdog. A team that should have been the favorite coming into the conference was treated like an afterthought. So, for a lot of people, this is begrudgingly the finals matchup, with the Nuggets somehow being an underdog. Of course, Miami is the 8th seed, and they beat Milwaukee and Boston on the way to get here, so they're much more of an underdog. But I digress. No more defending the title. Let's get into this actual matchup. Now, I'm not really going to dig into the regular season matchup stuff between these two teams because, frankly, this Miami Heat team is not what the Miami Heat were in the regular season. So let's first talk about how Denver defends Miami. Jimmy is probably going to be getting a combination of Aaron Gordon and Keep as his one-on-one matchup. I do think he could. Maybe get some Michael Porter Jr., but it would primarily be those two guys. And I think Aaron would be the much better matchup of everyone. We saw versus Boston that when the Celtics went with Derek White, Jimmy would just shoot over him versus when it was a longer and stronger wing, whether it be Jaylen Brown or Jason Tatum, he didn't get his offense going nearly as easily. Don't get me wrong, Jimmy didn't necessarily struggle versus Tatum or Jaylen, but it was definitely a little harder for him to get things going. So for Denver, I think it would be wise to just have Aaron get that primary matchup where he can be more physical, have more size and Keep he does, and also, I just think he's frankly a better defender. I think both Gordon and Keep can do a solid enough job at single coverage. Now, as for Bam, well, he has played against Jokic 6 times in the last 3 seasons, and his numbers are pretty mediocre. 18.7 rebounds on 53 true shooting. It's not much worse than his regular season numbers, but he's not outperforming and doing better than he normally would versus Jokic. Again, because Nikola Jokic isn't a bad defender. I did have some concerns about Bam's athleticism and its potential to overwhelm Jokic, but then I thought about it more, and Ad's athleticism didn't overwhelm Jokic, so I doubt it will versus Bam. Sure, Bam is probably the better athlete between him and now, unfortunately. Crime really healthy earlier in his career. Anthony Davis is a much better athlete than Bam. But right now, Bam definitely wins that title, I'd say, but he also is a less skilled and talented offensive player than Anthony Davis is, so I think that kind of negates that. Honestly, having Bam go at Jokic off with dribble might be the best way to approach this, as well as trying to use his vertical advantage on him with lobs and such, something the Lakers didn't try to do, so it might be worth exploring. Now, with the rest of Miami's players, you don't have to worry too much about those one-on-one matchups. It's pretty much just catch and shoot. Guys, so for the most part, I think you should just stay home on your shooters. I do think Gordon is a good enough matchup on Jimmy that one. On one, he can kind of handle that for most of the game. Don't think Bam's going to take too much advantage of Jokic, so really what I would do if I was Denver is play it straight. Defend those guys with the defenders you have on him and have your other guys. Stay home on shooters. I'm sure my reporter Jr. might bring help defense every once in a while, when necessary, especially if Jimmy gets by Bam. But for the most part, I think the way Miami picks you apart is because you collapse on those guys, so just play it straight. Stay home. Don't allow Caleb Martin, Duncan Robinson, Max Struss, and so on to get open threes, and you should probably be able to slow down Miami's offense to a decent capacity. Now, as for how Miami defends Denver, the first thing I would say is just throw out the notion of stopping or slowing down to call Jokic because it just isn't going to happen. He averaged 28, 14, and 12 on 60. True shooting versus Anthony Davis, who pretty much sealed his place as the best defender in basketball. This postseason, shutting down and even slowing down Jokic just isn't a thing. If Jokic has a bad game, it's because he isn't making shots himself, not because of the defense. He's going to get to his spots, and he's usually going to consistently hit his shots. Bam, Adebayo is a solid enough matchup for Nikola Jokic. It's not like you're giving up some kind of mismatch, but he's not going to slow him down. Everyone else for Denver, I do think Miami has a decent chance of slowing down quite significantly. I imagine Caleb Martin will be the primary matchup for Jamal Murray. I'd like to see it beat Jimmy personally, but I would not be surprised if they only went to that. In the late moments of this game to conserve Jimmy's energy offensively, I actually think Jimmy could get a decent amount of time on Aaron Gordon, and if that's the case, I would encourage Denver to try and use Gordon's physicality to wear Jimmy down a bit. I don't expect it to turn the tides by any stretch, but it could be something that makes Jimmy like 5 worse than he otherwise would be, so it's worth exploring, especially if it could potentially get Jimmy into foul trouble, which could actually really turn the tide. I'm a bit concerned for how Miami defends Michael Porter Jr. because you need a tall defender on him to get contests on his really high release. Point. But the best tall defender they have after Bam Adebayo, who's obviously getting the Jokic matchup, is Kevin Love, and I don't think he'll have the speed to keep up with Michael Porter Jr. running around the perimeter. Then it's Cody Zeller, and same thing, not to mention you don't want to play him and band together, so it might be a good series for Michael Porter Jr. You're going to want to stay home on him as well as don't give those guys open looks because obviously Jokic is going to find them, but you could do it with Aaron Gordon. Leave him open a little bit. I expect, especially if Jimmy gets that matchup, that he will do some free roaming on defense, which could potentially interrupt what Denver is trying to do on that end. He could get some swipes at Nikola Jokic in the post. Again, you're not stopping Jokic, but it could be something that, just like with the thing I said about Jimmy, makes him 5 worse and daring Aaron Gordon to it. Shoot has been a strategy we've seen. It hasn't really mattered that much, but it's better than actually sticking to him when he's just not that much of a threat. He's been shooting 35 in the playoffs, which is fine, but it's on low volume. And again, defenses aren't going to respect it that much. What will be interesting to see is if Miami goes to the zone defense that has been very effective for them in the past. Famously, it really bothered the Celtics in the 2020 playoffs, but the thing about that is Boston's offense has a tendency to be really basic and dumb with poor decision-making. I would not use any of those descriptors for the Denver Nuggets. I honestly think Jokic should have no issue picking apart a zone, and I don't know if it's actually going to be an effective strategy. Speaking of that strategy, it's also worth mentioning that from a coaching matchup perspective, this is the best coach that Eric Spoelstra has had to coach against thus far. I'd say he's had a fairly easy go of it with who he's dealt with so far. I don't think Boston's head coach is particularly good. I've always felt Tom Thibodeau was overrated. Mike Budenholzer, not a great coach, but not going to rag on him given the context of his personal life at the time. But safe to say, Eric hasn't even come close to a coach that can hang with him. Now, I think Eric Spoelstra is the best coach in the league, so I'm not expecting Michael Malone to outcoach him, but it's not going to be easy for Eric Spoelstra to outcoach Michael as he has thus far. So with that said, there's not a significant coaching advantage for Miami as there has been in every series they've seen to this point. It's also worth mentioning that both of these teams are healthy at the moment. Knock on wood. This has been a fairly injury-free playoff, so it seems like the best team should actually win here. So as for my actual prediction, I'm going to go with Denver. And 6, probably closer to 7 than 5, but honestly, 6 feels right. I think for both of these teams, they're facing the most difficult opponent they have yet. You would think Milwaukee and Boston would have proven more difficult than they have, but they didn't. I don't think Denver is going to beat themselves to the degree that Milwaukee and Boston have. That's not to say that Miami didn't beat them legitimately, and it was them beating themselves. But it's obvious that both of those teams have made mistakes pretty significantly when I don't think Denver is going to fall into that same trap. But betting against Jimmy Butler is scary. I picked Boston in the conference finals because it seemed like the team that should win, but in my gut, I really felt like Miami was going to do it. And then, well, they did. So I'm not saying anything against Miami with that much confidence.